This week on The Futurists, Joanna Lepore.
Our brains and our hearts are trained to be open to possibilities. Like, we're curious by nature. We are entranced by novelty. Like, we design things just because we can, because we want to know what it could possibly lead to. I mean, like, if you can tap into that from a business perspective, wow, huge opportunities.
I'm Ross Dawson, guest hosting the Futurists podcast this week. Brett and Rob are super busy speaking and working with clients around the world, so I'm stepping in. I've been a professional futurist for well over 2 decades now and a close colleague of Brett and Rob. I've been a guest on the show before and I'm delighted to switch hats and be the host. This week, I'm delighted to have as our guest Joanna Lepore. Joanna was established and grew Foresight at a couple of organizations you may have heard of, McDonald's and Mars Wrigley. And she's also the founder of Foresight Inside Group, a global group of foresight and long-term strategic leaders inside large organizations, as well as host of the Looking Outside podcast and many other exciting work and projects. Joanna, welcome to the Futurists.
Thank you so much for having me on, Ross, and congrats on the guest hosting gig.
It's fun. It's good to be on the other side of being interviewed to interview.
Yeah, I'm feeling that too, being on the other side at the moment. It's a nice change of pace.
As a frequent podcaster, you do all the interviewing.
Yeah. Pressure's on you now.
So I want to hear your story. So you have ended up in these extraordinary roles of, running Foresight for McDonald's and all sorts of wonderful things. And you started small, no doubt, to grow to something big. So what's been how did you find this was your path?
Really accidentally, as I like to tell people. So I didn't know that you could be a futurist. I didn't realize that was a full-time gig that you could have, especially at a big company and for a big brand. I was a marketer for about 10 years out of the Australian market, or kind of Australia APAC regions. And was always really interested in creating innovation. So products, services that helped my organizations, usually, big consumer brands or generally food brands, to look at where the growth was coming in the future so that we could invest in those areas. And because of that, if you think about it, kind of naturally feeds into Foresight, because Foresight is all about, investigating the changes in the world and helping to give your stakeholder a line of sight of how that might be a competitive advantage for you. So it kind of naturally feeds into marketing, strategy, innovation, all of those businessy functions that I did day in, day out. But I guess at one point, I kind of switched over much more heavily and intensively into innovation roles, where I was looking at white space territories and really looking at emerging trends and innovations. And because of that, I got my first kind of taste of foresight and then basically caught the bug. And as you said, really extraordinary opportunity to be able to then go and move to the US and live in New Jersey and head up and establish and grow the foresight function and capability for Mars Wrigley. And then to be able to move then to Chicago to do the same thing for McDonald's. So being kind of in those global headquarters and trying to create this very new thing. So like new processes, but also new mindsets and a cultural shift towards thinking about the long-term future. Absolutely amazing opportunities. And I caught the bug and now I'm in it. I'm you've sworn me in. I'm dedicated to Foresight now. Can't get me out.
That's awesome. It's nice. It's always nice to find your journey and path in life, hopefully earlier rather than later. So I mean, part of the thing is, as you say, you're working in marketing, and one of the things I always observe is that in marketing they always bring in these trend analysts. So you get a marketing offsite or marketing things, and they bring in your trend people. But of course, trends are not necessarily pointing to the future. So there is this cultural shift of how do you take marketing from saying, oh, here's the latest trend, let's hop on that, to extending that into meaningful thinking about, the longer term future.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think marketing generally has a little bit of a preoccupation on one part of foresight, which is cultural analysis, which is important, which is a part of what we do. But it's kind of investigating how consumer behavior is changing and how cultural norms are shifting. I guess you could say also where we should be speaking to consumers. So the changing media landscape, that's generally kind of the preoccupation of marketers. And so they're always kind of like feeling like they're a bit behind on that. So help me to make sure that I know how consumer behaviors are shifting so that I can adapt my strategy. Hence, they go to a lot of these generally ad agencies or cultural analysts to help them to stay on top of that. But I think to the point that you made, what's really critical is that you're looking at all of the other factors that influence the broader environment that a marketer operates in, or a great business leader. And, marketers more and more are asked to be not just a CMO, but to be a real, strategist, a financial analyst, a person that can really wear multiple hats. They talk about a marketer now becoming like the T, working horizontally across different functions, which basically means that you need to be thinking like a futurist. You need to think about macroeconomic conditions. You need to think about geopolitics and security risks. You need to think about the environment and how your sustainability teams are looking at risks and opportunities. So I think that's a really beautiful thing about Foresight, and using marketing as kind of a stepping stone to understand the changes in the world, starting by deeply understanding human beings and consumer behavior, but then pushing yourself to see more, to look for more of those changes in those kind of broader, macro forces that we as futurists look at every day.
Yeah. And I think I want to come back a little bit to, I suppose, the role of the foresight person in the organization to shape leaders in the organization so that they can become more, adopt that mindset. And I think that's part of the foresight function, is not just to go off and do your foresight, but to help the organization to be more future focused. So
you're spot on. So much of it is teaching.
Yes. Well, let's come back to that, because I want to dig into it. But you have spoken, and I suppose in various guises, around this idea of foresight as a profession. And so as you've observed and I've observed, there's I've been doing professional futures work for, well, certainly over 2 decades now, and I've seen in the last while there's quite a lot of people putting their hands up saying, "I'm a futurist." So and 2 sides to that. One is it's fabulous that there's interest in thinking usefully about the future. There's also, it can impact the perception of the field when everyone's putting their hands up, and sort of they have to distinguish between those who have perhaps a deeper professional approach to foresight as opposed to just spouting off. So where do you think we're at in terms of foresight as a profession?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very fair observation. And particularly for those of us in the foresight space, we feel this, and I say that we feel this like it's an emotional reaction that a lot of futurists have to this, because people can call themselves a futurist without any kind of accreditation. And I think that actually it's okay if we're welcoming people into the field and saying, you know what, you might not know exactly what you're doing at first, and that's okay. Like, we want people to come in from different disciplines and with different backgrounds and different ideas. Obviously, a great kind of diversity of thinking comes into foresight. That's really important. And not everyone can kind of come in fully qualified, because you might be in a part of the world where you don't even know what foresight is, or you don't have that qualification opportunity. What I think is really critical, though, is that you want to learn to be a better foresight practitioner, that you are constantly kind of seeking out information, learning more methods, speaking with other people who have been doing this for 2 decades like yourself, really trying to better yourself, and that you have at least an ambition to go and get some qualifications or some accreditations in the foresight field, so that you understand future studies. You understand how, particularly for a foresight practitioner in a business setting, how it started with Shell and how it's evolved to where it is now, that you know why it started the way that it is, and that you have a perspective about how to apply it in your business. And you can only really do that by understanding the methodology, the field, and sure, what I think is really great is that you can have these people who have an entrepreneurial mindset, or kind of the heart and soul of a futurist. And, generally these are people who are very naturally curious, very observant, visionary. They have a view of how the future should look. we really want those people to come into the foresight field, but calling yourself a futurist without really understanding the methods of foresight, I think is an issue and is a really like easily solvable problem to have, right? And I think that what's really great is that we are starting to see this growth of, particularly in the corporate space, foresight teams or practitioners. And the ability for them to get proper training in foresight is really easy. And there are so many more institutions that are offering this. You can get access to materials online really quickly, easily, and without a cost. So you can educate yourself, you can get education, you can make yourself essentially better at what you do. What futurist wouldn't want to do that?
Indeed, it is. Well, it's a path of growth. It's a path of growth and expanding ourselves to think more broadly and learn how the best do that. Are there any particular courses, accreditations, certificates, whatever that you'd point to as people one's aspiring futurists should look at?
Yeah, so I mean, I first got mine at the Institute for the Future. That was kind of my first official foray, and then in with the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And full disclaimer, I highly recommend them. But I'm also now going to become a partner with the Copenhagen Institute as of
Great.
May, and we're going to be looking at how do we build more corporate specific foresight training into what they do, which is really exciting. But that being said, when I first started in foresight and I hadn't had the training yet, and I was kind of thinking, oh, I know what I'm doing. Like, I know how to do trend analysis. I've been looking at trends my whole career. I don't need this like formal certificate. What I ended up doing was actually just speaking with futurists. So speaking with people like Andy Hines, Amy Webb, Paul Sappho, and these people are always like super generous, surprisingly, super generous with their time, yourself included, Ross, when I asked you for a phone call. And I just feel like you can learn so much from these conversations, like actually just having a one-on-one with people who have been doing this for a while, that have, maybe a perspective of what tools and methods might be useful for the specific problem that you're trying to solve. So even just doing that, I mean, it kind of goes back to the point we were saying before, that it really just requires you to want to learn and want to grow and be better at doing the work that we do.
So you mentioned, you mentioned Shell, which essentially has obviously been founded on scenario planning.
Yeah.
Scenarios or anything else, are there any particular methodologies that you have found useful, that you've gained insights from, that, part of your toolbox as you
Yeah.
approach foresight issues?
Yeah, definitely. And I know Jerome Glenn's been a guest on this podcast as well. And I haven't checked that episode out yet, but I will. And obviously he's the creator of the Futures Wheel method. That's a really constant go-to for me for anything that I'm doing, is really looking at the second, third, fourth order implications of things. And then what I love is kind of clashing methods as well. So if you clash Futures Wheel with a scenario planning exercise, for example, the one that I normally go to and that I used quite extensively at the companies that I worked at was backcasting. And backcasting kind of as a concept or as a method is a fairly kind of well-known idea that people can grasp quite quickly. So if you don't need to take them through like, what is a scenario planning exercise? What is a futures wheel assessment? You can say, hey, we're going to go to 2050 and come backwards to today. It's pretty easy. The reason that I love it is that I think what's really missing inside of corporations and that kind of business world when it comes to futures readiness or foresight is a vision of the future.
Yeah.
I know it's also been touched on in this show before as well, but this idea that business leaders are feeling so overwhelmed with everything that's going on in the world right now and so much complexity and how do I make the right decision? And, there's constantly disruptions and surprises. All of that is true, but you still need to know where you're going based on where you think you have a right to play and where you think that you can make a contribution to the world with your company and your product and the people that work for you. So creating a vision, I think, is absolutely integral as a starting point. And that's what backcasting really does so well. It really takes you to that future, makes it real, makes it kind of immersive and tangible, and then, helps you to say, well, me in that future, what can I do? What can I influence? And then, okay, let's create some action plans off the back of that. So I found that to be incredibly impactful. We did like 60 sessions of backcasting. at McDonald's, and the leaders absolutely loved it. Everybody took to it really quickly, even if they were like a little bit hesitant to start. So that's definitely probably my favorite.
Yeah, well, one of the strengths of backcasting is obviously the experiential part of it, sort of not necessarily describing it, but bringing it to life to the fullest degree possible. There's been some wonderful work in experiential futures at University of Hawaii and amongst others. But
Mm.
the and part of it, as you say, is this. For me, I always have this positive frame, and as in saying, well, we can create the future. We are creating the future. Everything we do, particularly if we're organizational leaders. And so in order to carve a positive path, we have to have a vision for what is possible. And so, of course, we need to be very careful about having, the very positive and the very negative, futures, or which is kind of, doesn't take you where you want to go. But you can, for example, say, well, here are aspects of this future which I can see, I can experience, and I like that, and I can sort of work out how we might have got to there from here, or these are the things which we can do along the way which can take us away from that. But I mean, the vision is critical in a extraordinary, uncertain, accelerating world. Unless we have vision around what it is we want to move towards, where the old classic line, if you got to know where you want to go in order to get there.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really beautiful about this in the corporate context is that business leaders in the business landscape are already creating vision plans. I mean, that's a strategy. You have a strategy for every department, you have one for the company. It's a very natural thing for business leaders to have to go and do. But generally, they do that once they kind of know where they want to go. Like they already know that they want to foray into like this growth area. So we're going to create a strategy around that. And so what Foresight allows you to do is then, like everything that you just said, is what about all the things we don't know, all the uncertainties in the world? How do you know where you're going to go if you're not kind of exploring all of that and sitting in that uncertainty as well, which is like a little bit less common for a business leader and obviously less comfortable, but can be so beneficial, particularly if, they are feeling all of that kind of anxiety about the growing complexities of the world.
Yeah. Well, also, most significant organizations have a vision statement. I
Mhm.
mean, there's a difference between a bunch of words and
Mhm.
and vision in the sense of I see it, and that's where you can bring something which is powerful and say, all right, well, okay, I see it, and now I want to create, and I've got an idea of how we might get there.
Yeah, and powerful is a nice word to use as well, because I think sometimes when you do read those vision statements, they're a little like boring and
Yeah.
predictable. And again, when you do it through a foresight lens and really take them into like a slightly further out future than what they're familiar with, it can push them to think in a slightly more creative and imaginative way. And so I guess like the challenge to that is that sometimes business leaders feel like that's a waste of time, like theoretically, before you take them through it. They're like, well, we don't have like the capacity for that, or like, what are we going to do with this? It feels like a frivolous exercise because creativity, imagination, curiosity, all of those things, a business knows they're important, but not necessarily resourcing for them right now in the midst of all of the other priorities that they have. But when you can demonstrate to them how that can be really valuable and, navigating all of the complexities of the world and everything else that we just talked about, yeah, it can be like a very unique exercise for business leaders. And I mean, that's, I think, part of the reason why there's such a strong case for foresight or design fiction or like risk mitigation, crisis management, like all of these teams that are now growing and resourcing in different organizations because they're doing things that are familiar for a business, but doing them slightly differently. And really, again, I think it's still a huge competitive advantage.
You mentioned design fiction.
Hmm.
Any particular experiences to share on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I was actually really lucky enough to have a few conversations with Julian Bleeker, and actually like Paul Sappho and Scott Smith, right when I was doing this massive exercise with our leadership team at McDonald's, because I wanted to implement design thinking or design fiction or like some element of this in an exercise with our leadership team. And what I ended up doing was kind of like I don't know, like a slight play on a design slash scenarios exercise where we just tried to create stories with the scenarios that we were playing with to make them like tangible. So we actually created something that you could touch and feel, and asking them to play archetypes inside of these stories to take on the role of one of these people in the future, and craft a narrative around these things. And again, it's particularly for very senior leaders, it's not really something that they're asked to do day to day. And so like as a foresight practitioner, you might feel a little bit nervous even asking for the time to be able to do something like that. But man, you can imagine how a session like that, or an exercise like that, can stand out amidst everything else that a business leader is doing. I mean, if you think about it,
Yeah.
your CEOs, your MDs, like they're generally like super busy reading a ton of things in the earnings reports, in the data generally. They don't have generally the space and the permission to be able to do something like that. So it can really open up their minds. And I mean, that's the whole point, right? Is something like design fiction, or something more creative and imaginative, like speculative fiction inside of a scenario planning exercise in a business context. That's really what it's designed to do. It's designed to get them to think about the possibilities. And again, like business context, possibilities lead you to innovation, which leads you to growth. So it's in aid of all of these things that business leaders need. And again, a different pathway to get to that.
Yeah, and I love what you said about opening minds, and that's for me is exactly what foresight is about. Anybody who is good at that, their role is to basically make leaders think about more things than they would have in the past, to have that breadth
Hmm.
of scope to enrich their thinking. And we can all have richer thinking. We can all sort of encompass more, and that's when you can start to have some the ability to make effective decisions in
Hmm.
extraordinarily uncertain times. So,
Yeah.
and as you say, the fictions or the narratives or so on, they sort of, it sounds like, all right, this is not a, what's the ROI on this? But in fact, it could actually be pretty big.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and more imaginative decisions as well. I mean, what I always say is foresight helps you to make smarter decisions about the future in a faster way, so you're more effective and you're more efficient about decision making, because you have a broader consideration set and you can solve problems in different ways. But it also, leverages your human skill in imagination. Like, I know you've spoken about this as well. We are naturally wired to think about possibilities and to think about what ifs from from a survival perspective, but also like our brains and our hearts are trained to be open to possibilities. Like we're curious by nature. We are entranced by novelty. Like we design things just because we can, because we want to know what it could possibly lead to. I mean, like if you can tap into that from a business perspective, wow, huge opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the things I love about humans. They're very curious,
Yeah.
and that's how we discover things. So there is a part here where there's lots of foresight reports, inside organizations more broadly, saying, okay, well, this is the whatever, name your date in the future. And there is a sometimes, or perhaps more often than there should be, a gap between saying, okay, well, here's our wonderful foresight report or analysis or project. What does this mean for our strategy? So how do we bridge that, moving from the foresight projects and work and reports and insights through to how this shapes and improves the strategy of the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the most critical part. And to be an effective foresight practitioner, whether you're offering a recommendation externally to your client or whether you're inside of the organization, you have to be able to pose a recommendation, and that recommendation needs to be really clearly aligned with where the business needs to go. So, like, even before you're doing some sort of an impact assessment or probability assessment of how this might impact your client and your internal stakeholder, you really have to understand what are they trying to achieve inside of this project and how can I help them to do that. Like generally people have a question that they're trying to answer, so help them answer that question, right? So I think this is part of the challenge for foresight, is that going back to what we were saying, Our job is to open minds and hearts and get people to think about possibilities. Like, yes, open up, but also we have to kind of go narrow in and not necessarily to say this is definitely going to happen or make predictions, but certainly to make recommendations of different pathways that the business could take, because ultimately that's what a business needs to do. It needs to make decisions. So I think, yes, giving a really clear recommendation that's aligned to the business challenge is critical. And then the second thing is, really creating a roadmap for the business of how to get there, because sometimes you might actually come out with a pretty obvious recommendation. Like the business already kind of was like, should we not? Yes, you should. Okay, cool. We kind of felt that way already, but they don't really know how to do that. Like an example is, if you're getting an organization to, you know, in Mars, for example, we were making chocolate and we were saying, well, is plant-based chocolate a thing? Like, is dairy-free chocolate, something that we should be investing in? We're going to have to get new capital. We're going to have to educate consumers. It's going to cost us more money, etc. So it's the how we do it that's sometimes the bigger question than the should we do it. And so I think that's also where a foresight practitioner should come in and not necessarily do that all by themselves, but a roadmap, a pathway, sometimes even a commercial business case, partnering with the team that's really working on that to create kind of like a how you could do this is really critical. And I think that's why, if you look at a foresight practitioner, they've got the evidence of the future all around them. They've got the signals of how other companies and brands are doing it. Sometimes someone that's living and breathing this problem in the business, they're kind of looking at it from one lens, like how my immediate competitor would solve this problem, or how I could do this in the most cost efficient or cost neutral way. Whereas a foresight person is always looking outside in. So we're seeing how you could solve that problem in new and unique ways, or, potentially even seeing new innovations or new startups that might be able to partner with you to do this in a different way. So that's where I think the partnership really needs to come into play, is foresight actually still being a part of that process end to end. So not just being at that front end and saying, here's all the cool things that are trending, off you go. Our job is done, but to really stay with that stakeholder all the way through the process, from recommendation through to the roadmap of how you could get there. And then hopefully, if you have a great foresight practitioner, they're there even afterwards, right? Like they're checking their assumptions. They're coming in and saying, okay, you had to make some compromises over here. This is what it could mean for you, right? You're still doing implications, you're still doing scenarios, just in a different way. But I think that's where foresight is most effective inside of a business, is where it's a partner throughout the entire process.
Yeah, and I think, one example of that could be starting with the future of the consumer, and then you come up with some ideas, and then you got to do the future of the supply chain on how do we deliver on that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's there's so much growth in that as well, in supply chain teams, sustainability teams, risk management teams. Like everybody wants a piece of foresight, which is a great problem to have.
So, drum roll, we're on to our lightning round.
Oh,
so,
goodness.
Snappy answers. Let's hear what you've got to say. So,
Okay.
Joe, what was the first science fiction you remember stimulating your mind?
Terminator 2. And I know you said lightning round, quick answers, but I'll tell you, this was like a really easy answer for me because I was in Poland, right? So this is like when we just started getting movies from America, which was a big deal. And I was 8 years old, and I was like sitting away from the TV, covering my ears and closing my eyes because I was so petrified by the Terminator. So, maybe that's part of the reason why I have a fear of AI.
Hopefully it hasn't scarred you for life.
Yeah.
All right. So, what technology has most influenced humanity?
So I'm not going to say most influenced. I'm going to cheat on this one. I'm going to say the one that I think is understated in its impact, because obviously it's not the biggest, but I think it's had massive implications, and it's plastic, and specifically plastic's invention in the start of the last century, and how it's been applied to everything and how it's impacted the food industry.
I've got to say, I still go back to that line in the what's the movie with Simon and Garfunkel, Paul Simon in it? Well, they had the song. Oh, it's a classic. Oh, I've forgotten the name of the movie. Anyway, the line was, you know, the future is the one word you need to know for the future: plastics. And that was in the
Yeah.
60s.
Well, that's accurate. It's an
Yes.
accurate prediction.
So name a futurist or other person who has shaped the way you think about the world.
I am gonna say this was a really hard one for me. And it constantly changes. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at this lightning round. I'm gonna say Amy Webb from a Foresight
Nice.
perspective. She was the first futurist that I thought, oh, cool, I can use the Foresight methods that I already know and apply futurism to them. Excellent. So
So what's your favorite prediction ever made?
I'm going to go with Carl Sagan and his 1985 speech to US Congress about the environment and how we were all screwed.
Yes, I think that was prescient. So hopefully not too prescient. And so which science fiction is most representative of the future you hope for?
Definitely Star Trek, Next Generation.
Ah,
And particularly because it's so altruistic and positive, and sci-fi is not normally very positive. Although I was reflecting on this and I was thinking, what's really interesting about Star Trek is that there's not a lot of personalization in it. Like if we were writing Star Trek today, Jean-Luc Picard would come in and the AI would already know that he wants his Earl Grey tea hot. And yet he has to order it every time. So maybe we were kind of like underestimating how much personalization would come into the future.
yes. So I love going back to the science fiction stories, and there are some ones in the from ages ago. You say, "Wow, they got that right." And God, did they get that wrong? And
Yes.
it's always nice to look back in hindsight.
Yep.
So we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Ross Dawson, speaking with Joanna Lepore. We'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Ross Dawson, speaking to our fascinating guest, Joanna Lepore. So I did have a quick look, and the movie I was thinking of was The Graduate, with the wonderful Simon and Garfunkel song Mrs. Robinson, where the young Dustin Hoffman gets told when he doesn't want to look for a career that the one word he needs to know is plastics. So he heard it then, and Joe says he's right.
Yeah. Good prediction.
So one of the fascinating things you do is the Foresight Inside Group, and I want to hear all about that.
Yeah, so I'm so proud of what we've done with Foresight Inside Group, or FIG, because it's only been around for about a year. And so I started it together with co-founders Adam Walker and Ben Moncrief, who are heading up Foresight at Disney and JLR, Jag Land Rover, respectively. And basically, it's for member organizations. So companies that have a dedicated Foresight team or Foresight practitioner, or are looking at kind of growing and expanding that. So at the moment, we have 10. We're just about to sign our 11th member organization. And a part of the reason why I'm like floored is the support and the interest in FIG, because like if you think about it, coming together with other Foresight practitioners, like we all do this quite often, but to be able to actually get the kind of dedication and commitment from companies to be a part of this is amazing. We've got actually Shell in there. We have companies like AXA, Nestle, PepsiCo, L'Oreal, some really, really big brands. And now we're trying to kind of diversify with different industries and different geographical representation. And like I said before, these are all companies that have in place a dedicated Foresight team. In some cases, they have one person that's just growing a brand new Foresight capability. And like I've been there before, that's tough. So it's nice to be able to lean on people in a network who can help you to kind of like build that out. And then in other cases, like Shell, they've got, like 60 people, been around for decades, they know what they're doing, they have a process and a methodology. But all of these people are curious. They're all willing to learn from each other. They all recognize that like the world is changing and they're observing that, but also their business conditions are changing. Their leadership team is constantly changing. So Foresight is facing similar challenges in different industries and in different geographies, different business challenges. So Yeah, it's been amazing. I think it's really exciting what we can do with it in the future. Particularly if you think about having this kind of network of people who know it firsthand, know what it's like firsthand to do foresight inside of a big business. Like, how do you influence stakeholders and how do you create a cultural change? How do you make an impact with the pilots that you're doing, etc.? And if we can come together and learn from each other and make foresight even more, I should say, even more credible and appealing so that it can continue to grow inside of that corporate private space. We believe that that is a huge opportunity. We think that every organization should be using foresight. Not every business needs to have a dedicated foresight team, but definitely we think that foresight should be more embedded in business, and foresight should be seen as a partner to every function. And well, we're well on our way to make that mission happen.
So I think that's a point. Like, taking a step back. All right. So what's the difference between those organizations that are part of FIG and have great foresight, and those organizations that do not have a foresight function and are not putting in that effort? So what's the
Yeah.
distinction? What makes these organizations ones that have, you know, made essentially the investment and recognize the value of it, as
Yeah.
opposed to those that don't?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna call on some business numbers here, actually, because the research has been done. There has been a study released in 2018 by Renee Rohrbrecht about the business impact of having a dedicated foresight team and not. And actually, what they've done in that study is kind of split out, if you have a little foresight or if you have a lot of foresight, if you have too much foresight, what's the impact? And essentially, what it's telling you is that if you do versus if you don't, it's going to have a higher top line return, 200% higher return top line, 25% bottom line improvement, and more strategic robustness. And then, you can go in and kind of see where and how that actually works. And the majority of it is more systematic observation of the world so that you can anticipate what's coming at your business. And if you think about it, a business leader might be listening to this saying, well, I already have, people that are looking at geopolitical risks, and I have an economist, and like, do I need foresight? And what's missing in that is the connection between those teams, the ability to say, how does the changing economic environment impact sustainability plans, or how it might impact cultural shifts in my marketing team? That's what a foresight team does. And the systematic observation of the changing environment. In other words, a process for horizon scanning, so that you're not just kind of like, okay, the earnings report is about to come out. We're going to have a look at how the conditions are changing, or, we're looking at the kind of immediate set of competitors that we normally look at, but going really, really broadly and systematically capturing how the world is changing so that you can give your business a line of sight of what should we be monitoring, what should we be preparing for, not necessarily acting on today, but thinking about for the future. And then a way to feed that through to innovation plans, right? To, potentially piloting new technologies that are coming down the line, to, piloting new products and services that you're going to be feeding through to your consumers. So that's essentially, what the studies have told us, is that when you do have a dedicated foresight team, it can help you to do all of this in a really systematic, methodical way that is proven to generate a stronger result, not for the foresight team, but for your entire business. So it's a pretty compelling case.
It is a compelling case, but I guess as I was suggesting, that
Mm,
not all leaders take that. So what's the difference?
mm,
Is it just there's a CEO sort of sees and understands the vision? Is it driven by the
mm.
board? Is it just is it the legacy of the culture? What is it that makes the divides between those organizations that see it and act on it,
Mm, mm.
and those that don't?
Well, one thing that I think is still true, despite the fact that we've had Shell in place using Foresight for a number of decades, I do think that the majority of businesses don't actually know that you can go and resource for this thing. I mean, certainly North America and Europe, we see a greater awareness of Foresight, generally still very much in government and policy making and things like that, less so in business, although it's still there. It's about 25% of companies in the European region and North America that have a dedicated team. So if you think about it, 25% sounds high, but it's not everyone. a lot of companies don't know that you can create this or what the benefit of it might be. And certainly, like if you look at some of the APAC regions or EMEA, they might not even know what foresight is. So you're using a very different language to describe this skill. The other thing is that you do generally need a visionary leader to understand the benefit of foresight, to advocate for it, to create a business case for it, to get the buy-in of the CEO. And, sometimes the CEO might be hesitant or skeptical, and that's okay. But if you have a great culture in place in that organization, they'll give you the permission to be able to go and do what you think is necessary. And so therefore, you're really relying not necessarily on the CEO, but on the senior leadership team and those advocates of change, those advocates for innovation and an innovative mindset to really go and explore how foresight could be embedded in their business. But one thing I'll say is that, what we're seeing is that foresight is placed in very different parts of organizations. So we're still seeing this very weird split between like putting it in marketing, putting it in insights and research, putting it in geopolitical security teams, sustainability teams, strategy, feeding up to the board. Like there's no rhyme or reason to this. And in a way that's kind of good because you can place it wherever you think it's necessary in a business. But in another way, it still feels like it's very new in the business landscape where people are experimenting. Where can I put it? Where can it make an impact? And I guess, what we're seeing is that a lot of companies put it in place and then move it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that, I think it really requires a business. If you think about a business structure, like a business hierarchy came originally from the military, right? So you have these like very traditional hierarchical structures in most businesses. You have like teams, like functions that have been around for a long time, marketing, finance, you know where to put them, you know what they do. Generally, like you might have a new team, like your generative AI team or your chief technology officer, chief data officer, new titles and new functions that come in, but less so. And even they, like to create a chief data officer probably took a long time for that company to invest in that kind of title and team. So foresight, like where the hell do I put that? What do I do with that? So it requires the leadership team to really be open to change, experimentation, to be a little bit more adaptable and flexible to the fact that this is something that is still making an impact in new and emerging ways. But again, like if you think about the fact that you're experimenting in something that is going to pay back, it's a worthwhile experiment to take.
Absolutely. I mean, you began to answer my next question. And so, people are aware that companies have foresight functions and so on. But, as you suggested, not all in the same way. So from, you've got one of the broadest views that there is out there. So what are some of the commonalities and the differences between foresight functions in organizations and how corporates say, oh, yes, we've got foresight, but possibly in quite different manifestations?
Yeah, the commonality is that we're, as foresight practitioners, we're all facing the same problems, and it's not dissimilar to the problems that a futurist will face from outside of a business. Resistance to change, the inability or the lack of desire to invest in the future, like interest, but lack of investment, like putting your money where your mouth is. And generally, like still there's a view that the foresight team or trend analysis team is there to come in and like give you the answer or solve the problem or give you like look into their crystal ball or their tarot cards and tell you, something magical that you haven't thought of before. And what a lot of what foresight is actually just like piecing together the information that you already know and just telling you what it could mean. So I think that we face the same challenges. That's the biggest commonality. The biggest differences is how it's applied. So in some cases, you'll see foresight really working directly with your board to be able to give you a line of sight of changing economic conditions for the next quarter. Some people might argue that's actually not foresight. In other cases, you'll have foresight feeding directly into the innovation and the design team and like working with your technology designers to create a product or a solution. In other cases, you'll have it working like just with consumer insights researchers to say, what are the emerging consumer behaviors that we should be exploring? So there's no kind of like consistent handbook for foresight practitioners in business. Like if as a marketer, if I step into a marketing role, if I'm, creating content for online, if I'm creating a product, I'm still going off those same marketing principles. Like I still know what my role in the business is as a marketer. It's very clear who I'm serving and how I'm supposed to do that generally. Whereas a foresight practitioner, it's not. You kind of have to come in, and I guess this is like the advice that I often give to people who are hiring foresight teams, is you have to have people that are very open, adaptable, flexible, and willing to work with change. So they have to be open to change themselves, because you're going to be ebbing and flowing based on demand, based on the problem that you're trying to solve right now. And generally, hopefully, you've got people that can work across seniority levels as well. They can like go in and talk to the CEO and give them advice about the macroeconomic conditions of the world. And you can go and talk to the people that are on the ground creating a product for the consumer. So it's a really, exciting role in that way.
Yeah, yeah, and it takes, as you say, well, everyone's got to be ready to change these days, since the world is changing. We have to be ready to change with it. But sometimes that can be, that's built into the function of the foresight. So we've been talking about thinking about the future and foresight and so on. So I want to. So let's look into the future itself, or as you say, all right. So you're scanning the horizon. I'm sure every day you're looking around and seeing what's got your attention these days. What are some of the things shaping your ways you're thinking about the future?
Yeah, I was going to say plastic. I mean, obviously, plastic is top of mind for me. I think some of the things that are really interesting for me are very much in that kind of food space, or how the food system is changing, because that's been the majority of my career. So I'm really worried about the decline in farmers. I think we sort of forget where our food comes from, or we don't care
Yes,
where our food comes
yes,
from, or we put blinkers
I
on.
care.
You care, I care. But I think most people kind of don't. And we know that we have to, increase food production by 70% to feed the growing population. We know that we have a decline of farmers from like 500 million to 200 million in the next few decades. We're not going to have enough farmers to grow the food. We're not going to have enough land. We're going to have this growing pollution problem in the way that we farm. And we're not going to be able to make enough food. So I'm really worried about that. I'm also worried about water, because water doesn't just go into what we drink, but in every food, every like
Yep.
AI, everything that we do. So I'm worried about the resources of our planet. What I'm excited about, that I'm keeping an eye on, is how the food system is changing in terms of the solutions that we're coming up with. So plant-based has had a bit of a bad rap, but I think it's an evolving space that
Absolutely.
will continue to innovate. And I'm excited about synthetic biology, particularly in Australia, with everything that we're doing with cell-based proteins, and some of the permission that the government is giving us to be able to experiment in this space and see how the consumer reacts, which is really interesting, because we're such a high meat consumption country. We're so wedded to our agriculture and our farmers. That's such a huge part of Australian life, as it is in Brazil, as it is in the US and many parts of the world. But in some of those other areas, there's kind of like a rejection of change and an ambition to maintain tradition. And I wouldn't say maintaining the status quo. I don't think that that's what it's about. I don't think it's about rejecting change. I think it's about, really finding the right balance between protecting what we have, which is important, and finding those ways to protect our future. So I'm really excited about, synthetic biology and where the evolution of the food system is going, because there needs to be some creative solving of these problems, right? If you think about those two things of like the resources depletion, and our ability to innovate through technology in our food, like those two things are hopefully going to work hand in hand. So that's kind of two things that I'm excited and
Yep.
worried about.
Well, I mean, of course, synthetic biology applies across not just food, but also humans and other life forms, and maybe
Yeah.
new life forms entirely. Which,
Mm. Yeah,
Which,
or like reborn life forms like the wolf that we just
yes, or the
brought back.
mammoth.
Yeah, the woolly mammoth, because we need some of those on the land that we have.
Well,
Yeah.
they played their role before, and also I'm sure that there are plenty of people who would go to a mammoth park to.
Yeah, that's true. Take
So
selfies.
you bet. All right, so let's just push forward. All right, so 2040. That's a decent time into the future.
Mm-hmm.
What's a story? What might
Goodness.
be happening, or what are some of these backcasting? If you were going to backcast 2040, just what's a story from 2040 which we can look forward to?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a big fan of looking backwards to look forwards. So if I take like the last 20 years to look into the next 20 years, roundabout, I mean, obviously we've had this massive boom in population. And I think now what we're seeing is this slow down stagnation of population growth. And obviously with that comes different, we'll see different migration patterns. We'll see maybe a change in perception of what it means to bring other people into our country and like growing the multicultural kind of new culture of these countries by necessity. If you think about like who's going to go into the military to protect us if we don't have a youth population. So I think those demographic changes are definitely going to have a huge influence in the next few years. I also think, technology is going to continue to play an absolutely huge role. If you think about, 20 years ago, we were just starting to get our heads around the smartphone. We still had dial-up internet. We had MySpace. So next couple of decades are going to have a tremendous change. Like we probably will not be using TikTok. We probably won't be using Instagram and Facebook. So it's interesting to think about how are we going to want to communicate, if at all, on these social platforms? What do we consider to be helpful versus unhelpful and unhealthy? And also, how AI is going to play into that, how potentially quantum computing is going to play into how we use technology from a day-to-day perspective. And then maybe going back to my Star Trek example, one thing that I think is really surprising is that we do have this obsession with personalization. Like we like mass solutions for things, but we also want to feel like an individual, like tailor everything to me. So how is that potentially going to come to life in 2040? But it probably most definitely will. And then I think, like cultural behaviors are really interesting for me to observe. Again, like 20 odd years ago, we were getting rid of smoking in public. Like we were
Yes.
still smoking on airplanes 25 years ago. So what kinds of cultural norms are going to be no longer acceptable in 2040, I think is really interesting to observe. Sometimes when we talk about the future, people say what's going to stay the same because things don't seemingly change that drastically over 10 years, or sometimes it feels like even 20 years. Like 9/11 for me, when I think about that, it feels like a lifetime ago, but things feel relatively similar to like not drastically different to
Mm.
then. And maybe it's my age range, but if I think about the future and 2040, probably things will still feel very familiar, but they'll be brought to life in different ways based on the cultural norms, based on what's acceptable, and based on the infrastructure that's allowing that to become acceptable, or the leaders that are in power by that time. So we'll have like 3 presidents by that point. So everyone's really
Yeah.
obsessed right now with Trump and the impact that he's having. We'll have 3 more presidents by, to like 2040,
Hopefully.
2050. So who knows who that's going to be? Hopefully it's not going to be Trump by some trickery. But yeah, it's going to be ruled by different people. It's going to have different cultural norms slightly, and it's definitely going to have different technology that's enabling even greater personalization. That's my crystal ball reading for you.
Nice. Well, I think I'd say the cultural shifts could be more than slight, but we'll see. I'd say my prediction is we're going to have a wild ride for the next 15 years.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
And you and I will be older and hopefully a little bit wiser by
yeah,
that point
yeah, I think
as
we can
well.
work on that.
Yes.
So, Joe, how can people find out more about all the wonderful things you're doing?
Yeah, so I've just created a website. So I realized that I'm doing a lot of different things, and people are like, how are you doing all the things that you do? I get a lot of energy out of these things, but communicating them is sometimes a challenge. So jolepore.com is where you can go. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. Check out my podcast, Looking Outside. Reach out to us at Dig Insights, where we're doing a lot of trend innovation mapping work. Reach out to us about Foresight Inside Group if you're doing foresight in a business and you're interested in joining. And reach out to me if you're interested in, like, okay, I'm sold. Let's get foresight in my company, and I can help you with that.
Fabulous. Well, that's a wonderful list of activities. You are going to keep busy, that's for sure.
Yeah, just how I like it. Too busy.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thanks for sharing all your insights and all the great things you're doing to support foresight happening in corporations and helping us create a better future.
Always great to talk to you, Ross. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
And thank you to the Futurist team. We're going to see you in the future.